They operate in strictest secrecy at the cutting edge of Australia's defence. They're creative, unorthodox and comfortable in chaos. For over 50 years, the Australian SAS has put their lives at risk, deep behind enemy lines. This is the only television history ever supported by this highly secretive regiment. We take you beyond the stereotypes to reveal the unexpected story of the real people who transformed SAS from the ugly duckling of the Australian Army into pride of place as Australia's force of first choice.
Right, left hand trawler's blue. There's definitely only two here, radar.
In the 1980s, after the Allied failure in Vietnam, the Australian government abandoned the forward defence policy of fighting communism on the Asian mainland. It withdrew completely from foreign wars and focused on defending Australia's coastline from a seaborne invasion expected to come through the northern archipelagos.
While Defence Force and Army as a land component was developing capabilities for the defence of Australia, there was discussion constantly in SAS about our role in defence of Australia and how appropriate our role would be. And the difficulty was always, was this a credible threat? Was the landing of military forces from the north on mainland Australia really the threat? And it never seemed credible. And Mike Jeffrey, who had been CO of SAS and then had rose to general rank within Army, raised these concerns in 1990. The Kangaroo series of exercises that every 2 years practiced the defence of Australia and those capabilities was questioned by Mike Jeffrey if that was an appropriate and credible threat, or was it more likely that terrorists would hop onto an aircraft, fly into Mascot and then mount operations in one of our major population centres. And my understanding is that this was a message that wasn't received well. So along with these major exercises that were conducted for many years, there was no interlinked counter-terrorist exercise.
Well, in respect to Fortress Australia, I personally never believed in it. I could not see any country wanting to capture Australia. You know, for what purpose? Lebenstorm or minerals? I mean, minerals and so on these days are all global corporations, activated by one country or another, and why take the risk? So I thought that was all a bit silly. My concern always has been, in respect to small-scale lodgements or terrorist activities, has been the vulnerability of our national vital installations, our offshore oil rigs, our mining operations and so on, which are so important to overseas trade and our economy. But that was handled, I guess, when we really got the counter-terror role, when that was specifically given to the Special Air Service, and that happened in my time as commanding officer of the regiment. And the Chief of the General Staff, General Sir Donald Dunstan, sent me on a 53-day world inspection of all the Special Force counter-terrorist forces around the globe. GSG-9 in Germany, the Dutch Special Forces, which were brilliant, 22 SAS. I looked at some of the Arab, Jordanian, I looked at the Americans. So the whole range of groups. And from that I got a pretty good idea in terms of what our counter-terror capacity should look like and how it should be developed. And that then led to my promotion to full colonel and the establishment of the Directorate of Special Action Forces. The establishment of it was critical development, I think, in the whole Army structure, because what it did was put all the elements of special forces in those days, the SAS and the commandos and the communicators, under one command umbrella, which happened to be me at the time. And as it happened, I was located only 3 doors down from the Chief of the General Staff and a few doors away from the Chief of the Operations. And from that directorate, we've then seen the expansion now to Special Operations Command, under a 2-star Special Operations Officer who commands all the Special Ops units of SAS commandos, signals, aviation, and all the other bits and pieces. And he works direct to the Chief of the Defence Force. He works to the highest officer in the whole command chain, because the game is now lifted in a political, operational importance sense.
I believe that the period of what I and a few others who served in the regiment now call the Long Peace covered the period from 1972 to approximately the time of the First Iraq War.
During the Long Peace, the regiment needed its place in the Army's order of battle. This demanded visionary, point-of-the-spear leadership, but creating an SAS corporate identity proved a huge task.
And it was a very tough place to be. I went to the SAS in '83, and why it was tough was because there was so much introspection, because there was one thing that we could put a hand on and say, that's where we're going and that's who we are. And we're constantly into this navel gazing of what defines us, what are we, what's good about us, what can we do, what can't we do.
Were we searching for how we could provide for national effect, for military effect? Absolutely, all the time. And that reflected in the way we trained, the way we thought about the region, the way we thought about, the world at that time.
Everyone within the regiment, from trooper upwards to the commanding officer, was concentrating on how to improve our techniques, how to improve our selection processes, what were we doing wrong, how could we do it better. You could say that in that period of time, we were continually trying to raise the bar. Certainly up until 1978, those fine people in the regiment had no idea why they were trying to raise the bar. They were simply raising the bar for the good of themselves and the good of the regiment.
Although terrorist attacks overseas persisted, Australia stayed relatively quiet and the CT squadron saw no action. Within SAS, the novelty of CT was wearing off.
They realised that while CT had provided some powerful employment, it actually didn't give us any operational Guernseys whatsoever. We were breeding this lemon that was never going to be used. So we were too good, we were too successful at it.
Many in SAS were dismayed when it was proposed to transfer the prestigious CT role to No. 2 Commando Regiment.
Given the characteristics that we were asking for in the recruits into commandos, they were ideally suited for the counter-terrorist role, which is, for all intents and purposes, just a specialised assault. But SAS, seeing this as the only chance that they might have for operational service at that time, were very reluctant to let it go.
Being in this regiment, to me, is a lot like, being training for the Olympics, knowing that there may never ever be an Olympics. And if you get an opportunity to use those skills where you've seen, your mates die in training, of course you jump at the chance. And everyone in this unit wants to be employed on operations. That's why they're in the unit.
But for me, holding on to the counter-terrorist capability meant that we might be tied to Australia, and holding the counter-terrorist capability and response capability in Australia at the very time when our skills were actually required overseas in a more SAS role.
I guess one of the most frustrating things for me was that during the bulk of my career, the highest strategic academic minds in defence for years have been bloody wrong. They've been writing white papers that have been telling us to concentrate on the defence of Australia, and yet 90% of our operational experience has been overseas since then.
We wanted to make ourselves relevant in whatever way we could be relevant, really from a military perspective, but also from a national perspective. So when you join, special forces by its very nature, it goes where the work is. It does things that normal conventional forces don't do. And I think that's a really important thing. It does things that in the toolbox of what the Defence Force and the nation's got, it's got to be able to do things that are different.
On his appointment as commanding officer of the Australian Special Air Service Regiment in 1988, Jim Wallace differentiated ideal political scenarios from real conflicts likely to involve SAS.
In my first week in SAS, I went into the regiment, I held up the 1986 white paper and I said, well, we can do everything that the government says it wants us to do in this now. But if we're going to be ready to do what the government actually wants us to do, we're going to need to be able to respond to problems in West Irian, in Timor, in Papua New Guinea and in the Solomons. We're going to need to be able to do joint operations with the Americans, and we're going to need to be able to respond to a counter-terrorist activity that might involve an Australian plane in Asia.
Wallace's assessment clearly reflected the regional spread of dissident, separatist, nationalist and subversive groups. SAS kept its own watching brief on Asia, the Arc of Instability and other potential trouble spots. Islamic fundamentalists like Al-Qaeda, Jemaah Islamiyah, Darul Islam and Dewan Dakwah Islam Indonesia used tactics such as armed attack, assassinations, bombings, mortars and arson. Australia felt it should be engaging with problems in the region, and using small SAS teams was quick and quiet. In 1981, SAS teams had provided insertion training to the Philippines Armed Forces in submarine entry and exit, underwater vehicles, sea-to-shore insertions and covert beach reconnaissance. Armed action was needed on the southern Philippines island of Mindanao, where the Moro Islamic Liberation Front was waging guerrilla war against the government. The front demanded that Mindanao become an independent Islamic nation. SAS training included black operations, rehearsing for assassinating key enemy leaders. The training had its price. When a US Special Forces C-130 crashed into Subic Bay, SAS lost 3 soldiers.
This is the rule of law in Fiji today, the point of a gun.
SAS was again put on standby in 1987, when the democratically led Fijian government was ousted in a military coup.
He's still under house arrest.
The trouble was racial, with Polynesian Fijians rebelling against the Indian Fijian majority.
Governance by the gun, by military, must come to an end.
The deposed Prime Minister appealed to Australia, seen then as the big brother of Pacific Island nations. Australia was uncomfortable with this role, but as the brutality, rioting and arson increased, an SAS squadron was moved forward. In an evacuation, the SAS would protect vital routes to the seaports and airports. But the threat subsided and no evacuation was needed. In the next year, in unstable Vanuatu, an SAS squadron was put on standby to rescue hostages and evacuate Australians after a paramilitary force almost overthrew the government of Prime Minister Lini. Vanuatu had been courting Libya's anti-Western Colonel Gaddafi, a known sponsor of international terrorism. However, the coup failed and an uneasy peace ensued. Not all regional troubles of direct concern to Australia in the arc of instability were political, cultural or religious. In 1989, a deadly civil war broke out in Bougainville over the rich Panguna copper mine. Bougainville Islanders rebelled against the Papua New Guinea government, accusing the mine of industrial pollution of the surrounding area and of economic exploitation of the islanders. The resulting violence shut down the mine, a major source of revenue for the PNG government. SAS had already written operational plans for this contingency. In a bloody 10-year jungle war, the rebel Bougainville Revolutionary Army, or BRA, led by Francis Ona, a Panguna mine surveyor, defied the PNG army. Desperate to reopen the lucrative mine, the PNG government hired mercenary troops from Sandline International in London to destroy Ona's BRA forces. Australia objected strongly to this.
Any use of mercenaries would be absolutely and completely unacceptable, would do great damage to PNG in the eyes not only of Australians, but in the eyes of people who PNG need as their friends for years into the future.
Fearful that Papua New Guinea could be on the brink of political collapse, the Australian government committed an SAS team to the problem.
We were asked to come up with strategic options to try and interdict the Executive Outcome Mercenary Group and prevent their aim, which was to land in Booker and sweep south and eliminate the Bougainville Revolutionary Army, in particular Francis Ona. We actually put some SAS troops into Port Moresby in 1996-97 with the possibility that there would be no lawful government of Papua New Guinea, and we'd be bordering on putting troops in to try and find somebody who would still resemble the legal government of Papua New Guinea. I still see that scenario as potential, and it could happen in the next couple of years.
Eventually, a ceasefire brought hope of a truce.
The Australian Defence Force were providing forces to support the Peace Monitoring Group as it established itself on Bougainville to assist with the transition to a truce between the PNG government and the Bougainville Islanders.
In 1989, the momentous breakup of the Soviet Union and the fall of the Berlin Wall abruptly ended the Cold War between European communism and the West. The massive paradigm change in world conflict triggered trouble. Seeing a great political power on its knees, armed factions began flexing their muscles. Lawlessness and local conflicts erupted around the world, led by tribal, political and criminal groups. In 1991, SAS medics joined the United Nations mission to Turkey and northern Iraq to assist Kurdish refugees who had fled when Iraq attacked its Kurdish minority. SAS signallers polished their skills as part of the United Nations force monitoring the truce between the Moroccan army and Western Sahara independence fighters. Another chance to extend the SAS skills profile came in early 1990 when an SAS element was sent to war-torn Cambodia. 4 warring political factions were fighting each other, causing a major humanitarian disaster and unsettling their Indo-Chinese neighbours. A United Nations mission was sent to Cambodia to run free elections and disarm the 4 factions, including the murderous communist Khmer Rouge. An Australian 65-man force helping the UN to protect the ballot from factional violence included highly skilled SAS radio operators. But there had been earlier resistance to including SAS soldiers in this United Nations force.
The UN operation in Cambodia had an interesting element which included the positioning of individual people, or ones or twos, into villages by themselves with the task of communicating back to the UN headquarters. Now, this was an ideal task for SAS because they were trained to relate to Indigenous people and also trained in long-range communications. However, we were unable to take advantage of that because the view in the force at the time was that SAS, or rather special forces, were not suitable for UN operations because they were all seen basically as cutthroats.
This myth of a brutal, homicidal SAS, an ancient prejudice, was brushed aside by its Hearts and Minds campaign to win over the leaders of the day.
I think posturing has always been a major aspect of having a defence force, so that you develop a capability and then make it known that you have that capability. And we've done that for years with the F-111s, the F-18s in the RAF, and especially those units that have a strategic capability. And I see SAS sitting in that mould. And yes, there will be this aspect of being able to demonstrate that capability so that an enemy, or wherever that threat may be towards our national interests, sees that they have to deal with the SAS capability. So in a way, SAS is going to have a public face, a publicised face, and a publicised capability. And that will be known by those that want to threaten us.
I think if you were to speak to some defence ministers past, and particularly over that late 80s and through the 90s and into recent times, they would all start to see a rise of consciousness in themselves as to how the SAS can be applied to meeting foreign objectives.
We used to conduct what we call dog and pony shows, which are displays of skills, abilities and activities to be conducted by SAS across a full range of operations. These were for visiting VIPs, which included then Prime Minister Bob Hawke, Minister of Defence Beazley, and also senior Army, Air Force and Navy figures, as well as visiting dignitaries. And this paid dividends with the selection of J Troop to go to Somalia.
In the year before, 1993, US Special Forces had tried to force the local Somali warlord, Mohammed Aidid, from power. The disastrous operation, portrayed in the film Black Hawk Down, had ended in horror.
It was a battle which brought events in southern Mogadishu.
1,000 Somalis had died, and American corpses had been dragged through the streets. Worse, severe drought and failing harvests had plunged 4 million Somalis into starvation. Warlords were preventing the United Nations from distributing food supplies. J Troop, a 3-squadron SAS, was part of the United Nations multinational force sent to ensure that the food reached those in need. Their job was to protect the Australian contingent of medics, radio operators, engineers and air traffic controllers keeping Mogadishu Airport open.
Members of J Troop were selected from a broad range of SAS skills for insertion, from vehicle, air and water operations, and also from their minor skills, patrol medic, demolition users, signallers, and their broader SAS skills of assaulter, sniper and demolition user. They were also selected for compatibility to ensure that there was no friction within the group, and so that no problem could not be overcome by a simple chat and a clear direction about what was to go. The squadron was very divided about who should have been in that membership, and a lot of people who would have cut their own throats to get on that job. It was the first operation in 10 years, and we're very fortunate to be selected. There was a considerable angst within the Special Operations Headquarters and SAS elements at the risk of sending us across to there.
The SAS troop nicknamed themselves the Gerbils after the small animals in their camp area outside lawless Mogadishu. Local Somali gunmen often fired on United Nations soldiers, but the Australian contingent was never attacked, as the gunmen very quickly learnt to avoid the fierce, sharp-shooting SAS troop. SAS veteran Darren Loftus previously fought in deadly Somalia as an infantryman with the 1st Battalion of the Royal Australian Regiment.
Somalia was a very dangerous place to be, and the reason for that is because there were every man in the country carries a gun. It's a part of manhood, and the bigger the gun, the bigger the man you are. Come to disarm them was another thing. Our mission there in one area was to disarm the population and bring calm to the place. So it was very, very dangerous at times, and we got shot at almost every night when we were out on an observation post.
The issue with Somalia was that not everyone who carried a gun was your enemy. To protect themselves and protect their villages, most males were armed, and in fact they were licensed by the UN to carry weapons.
But the danger wasn't only guns. The Somalis chewed cat, a feel-good drug. But when the drug wore off, they could become very violent.
So just because a person had a weapon doesn't make him a threat, but given the added of cat in the afternoon and mental destabilisation that causes, it could cause that person to become aggressive towards you. So a softly approach was required sometimes.
But some SAS sensed the ultimate futility and ideological irrelevance of foreign aid.
I guess I first had a political awakening, as I'd probably describe it, in my operational service in Somalia, where I saw that the reason that we're actually there was more to do with the way the media portrayed the situation, specifically that, you know, kids and people were dying of starvation there was a civil war. You know, our job was to try and separate the combatants, which sounds like an admirable thing to do so that the aid could go through, but it also became apparent to me that we were imposing things on Somalis that they just didn't want us there. That was all part of their culture. It's a Horn of Africa, you know. Famine and starvation there is commonplace. Life is cheap, and although no one likes to see their children die, but the reality is that they actually saw us as almost being a bigger evil at times. It made me realise that, you know, there are times when politicians don't really understand the consequences of employing military operations, and to me it was imposing Western values on a culture that didn't want to have those imposed on them. Sure, you save one generation of kids, but then what do? Do you go and teach Somali women, you know, birth control? What right do you have to try and force that down the throat?
But far worse than Somalia awaited SAS soldiers.
Concurrently with our deployment to Somalia, elements of SAS were put on standby to go to Rwanda and assist there. That was done as a force augmentation, mainly as medics to support the medical support group there.
Rwanda was a nation gone mad. After years of bloody tribal warfare between the Hutus and the Tutsis, thousands of Hutu Rwandans had left their villages and fled to refugee camps for safety. An entire nation was displaced. 15 SAS medics were sent to Kabeho camp, where Hutu refugees had fled for safety.
Our job was to have a look at those being evacuated back to their villages to make sure they were medically fit for that journey.
But rival Tutsi soldiers attacked the camp.
We came round the corner to the main central part of the Kabeho township to find 120,000 people all corralled in together. The Tutsi army, the RPA, had fired into the people and forced them like sheep all into one area. In that process, 11 babies were killed in the stampede. And at the time we thought that was bloody shocking. You know, where are these babies? We need to make sure they're treated properly, and this is awful. It was nothing compared to what we were about to face. It was overflowing. There were no nurses, there were no doctors, the MSF guys hadn't arrived. The first person I remember looking at was an old lady who had been hit with a machete, and it hit her in the bridge of the nose, all the way down here. So all of this was just suspended here. And she was just sitting there with blood dripping and not saying a word. We had no idea where to start. Everybody had horrific injuries like this, and there were hundreds. The Rwandan soldiers who were coming down the mountain singing formed up on one side of the refugees and started firing into them. The refugees, or the IDPs, then stampeded down this re-entrant, down this valley, but the soldiers, the RPA, already had machine guns and mortars set up ready to catch them, and just opened up on these people and were mowing them down. You'd see a family of 4 running along and a mortar land in the middle of them, and then there'd be no family of 4. You could see these poor refugees running through the foothills, only 200 or 300 metres away, with a team of RPA soldiers chasing them down. And they would fire a shot, miss, they were terrible shots, chase again, fire a shot, wound this poor soul, and then all gather around and bayonet him to death. and we were restricted in what we could do. We didn't have the mandate to stop this from happening. It was bloody awful for these young soldiers to be witnessing this sort of stuff. We had a bit of a group debriefing, and they went around, you know, asking people how they felt, and I was surprised to hear that people were having trouble sleeping and people were really affected, and you know, the dreams and the stress and everything else. I got to John Church, the major at this time, said, you know, how are you feeling, John? He said, I feel fantastic. And I let out a little bit of a laugh. I thought, you Wally, you can't say that. All these people are struggling and you feel fantastic. He said, no. He said, look, you know, you've dragged me away from my girlfriend, from a job that I love doing. But he said, you sent me into that refugee camp. He said, I didn't kill anybody. I didn't cause that. He said, but just by me being there, I saved the lives of 2 or 3 people. And he said, by bearing witness on that, we probably stopped the execution of 110,000 people. He said, I did a lot, and I feel really good about myself. And I thought, good on you. And I think John confirmed how I was feeling, but I didn't realise it. He really put it well.
In all of those operations which were conducted in the late 1990s, some of the activities that occurred are classified in as much as small, discrete SAS elements went forward in many locations. The activities that they conducted in the main remain classified and will probably for forevermore. And I guess it typifies that some of the things that the SAS do are truly strategic in nature, and those capabilities pull the rest of the regiment forward in terms of the scope and the capability for SAS to deal with truly sensitive issues.
After '96, towards then, the smaller jobs, the assistance, the security advisory were starting to come to fruition. I think a lot of people were once again realising that we weren't just a killing unit. You know, we could go in there, we could assist, we could provide medical assistance, we could guard people, we could look after people, people could cry on our shoulders, and you'd do what was required to get the job done. One of the small deployments that I was involved in is we deployed over to Indonesia, completely civilian. Did not take weapons, but we were tasked to establish emergency evacuation points, passages through town, and the assembly of expats. We just went over on our standard passport. I remember we got whisked straight into the Australian Embassy and based out of the Australian Embassy. Very closed doors. We got picked up from the hotel, taken to the embassy, driven around establishing the points, back to the embassy, back to the hotel. There was never a time where we weren't unguarded or unescorted. We got driven around identifying where the large populace of Australian expats were living. From there we'd establish rally points to safe routes to air bases, airfields, helicopter pads, or any place that we could get expats out quickly. Trying to get people out during a disturbing time, there's a lot of panic. So once again it comes down to your demeanour, your training to calm them, to try to trust you and let them know you know what you're doing, you know they're safe. You have to be aware, of course, that the enemy can hit you from any direction. They're not dressed in uniform. You know, they're all, majority of the time, smiling people with obviously alternate agendas. They could be carrying weapons, they may not be. I think it was once again trying to expand the portfolio of what the SAS is capable of. A job is a job.
In 1997, despite the UN-monitored elections, Cambodia suffered a political coup and was again plunged into civil violence. Concerned for Australians in Cambodia, the Australian government mobilised Army and Air Force elements, including some SAS.
In 1997, not long after the Sandline affair, we were stood up again to assist with the evacuation of Australian nationals from Cambodia, Phnom Penh in particular. Planning elements went forward. Bob Hunter was the lead SAS planner.
The coup from the Hun Sen-led communist groups against the Fun Sen Pek governing group resulted in an insecure situation on the streets. It actually resulted in fighting and the closure of the international airport. So once things settled down after a few days, the Australian government looked at the circumstances and decided that they would implement what was known as a services assisted evacuation.
Following the coup, the Australian Air Force brought hundreds of people home from Cambodia. During this period, SAS soldiers back at their base at Swanbourne, Western Australia, were pushing the envelope of SAS capability in another direction. They were adapting the fighting skills of the counter-terrorist squadron to the new area of close personal protection.
1997-98 really represents a wind shift in SAS's operational tempo. Prior to that, up until the late 90s, SAS was doing bugger all. There was a few bits in Somalia and Cambodia and so forth, but really it was after 97-98 when we started to get involved in Timor, the Solomons, Afghanistan, and then Iraq, and then Afghanistan again. So 98 onwards, you saw close personal protection really become one of the core roles of SAS. Not that they necessarily wanted it, but when you had operations overseas involving conventional main forces, which attracted VIP visitors, such as ministers and prime ministers, not to mention chiefs of defence force and chiefs of army, then the requirement to protect them obviously loomed as a major priority.
SAS took the best close-quarter battle techniques from other countries and adapted them to what they expected to meet in the arc of instability and elsewhere.
There is a very definite modus operandi and set of techniques and procedures to use when providing close personal protection, both in an urban environment or in a wider rural environment.
To do CPP in those environments, it'll depend on what assets we're using, so what mode of transport we're getting around with. If it's helicopters, we obviously have to do liaison with them and then recon the sites that we're going to go to. So we'll actually fly out there earlier, have a look around, make sure everything's secure, possibly leave someone in location there, and then we'll go back, and then when the dignitary arrives, we'll fly in and everything will go smoother.
They're constantly scanning for threats. They will never move to another environment without knowing that that environment is secure.
The ability to see or sense when someone's possibly going to be a threat is something that we're pretty good at doing. The thing that will attract my attention is their dress. Like if the dress is overly concealing, so a lot of loose robes which could hide weapons when everyone else is wearing not so concealing clothing. People that are about to commit an aggressive act are normally a lot more aware. They're looking around constantly. They're looking around their shoulder. You can see in their face that they're not concentrating, or they are solely focused on who they're trying to get or what they're about to do.
There is essentially an inner cordon of physical security and an outer cordon of intelligence security, information security, so that those individuals in the close personal protection team themselves are cognizant of what's going on beyond their immediate purview.
Generally we try to minimise our presence, so we'll have him in the centre and we'll sort of slink away to the sides and make sure all the focus is on him rather than on him with heavily secured with people around him. Because to see so many people with guns around you, looking aggressive, it doesn't set a good public image.
We put that close personal protection team not simply to provide close personal protection, but more specifically to gather intelligence and understand the intent and the thinking so that we could facilitate, assist and provide whatever support we needed.
The preference for most of those at the senior level was to use special forces to provide that protection. I say that because I make that point because the military police also have a close personal protection role. And in fact, in recent years, the balance has been redressed where military police have reassumed a lot of that responsibility because we in Special Forces saw it as a bit of a distraction over time because it takes a lot of training and so forth.
In the 90s, not only was SAS committed to niche operations and close personal protection, but the CT squadron was also training hard for a mission of potential global importance.
The thing that was really dominating the period from the mid-90s through to 2000 was the Sydney Olympics.
The Olympic Games had been the target of terrorists for several decades. In 1972, Black September terrorists killed hostages at the Munich Olympics. And at the 1996 Atlanta Olympics, there was a pipe bombing of a large crowd. The globally televised Olympics, with the world's best athletes centre stage, would attract huge crowds and a vast viewing audience. The Sydney Olympics could be a prime target for publicity-hungry terrorists.
The Australian government's end state was Australia open for business, and they could not afford anything to go wrong that could possibly tarnish the reputation of the Australian government in running an international event. If an incident had taken place that could have affected the scheduling of a gold medal event, if that had been delayed by more than, I think it was 24 hours, the gold medal event would have to be cancelled, and that would constitute failure in the eyes of the planners and the Australian government.
SAS began comprehensive planning for the anti-terrorist measures of Olympic security in 1996, 4 years before the Games. Detailed planning is one of the key factors in the high mission success rate of SAS.
The planning is conducted at all levels, so at the lowest level, the soldiers will do their own planning. So, and normally they're the ones in harm's way here, so they'll ensure that before they go on an operation or a patrol or whatever it may be, they'll spend the appropriate amount of time planning to the last detail that particular operation. It's what we call the what-if principle. They will go through every aspect of the problem that they're confronting from start to finish, the insertion, right through to the operation itself, right through to the extraction from the operation, in the minutest detail to cover off on every what-if. What's the worst thing that could happen to me at this point in time on the mission? If that happens, what do I need to do to counter it? And that's what I call attention to detail.
In the long and intense training build-up, SAS learnt how to secure the city of Sydney and to test their responses to various scenarios in Olympic venues. For example, the CT squadron used simulated terrorist events to rehearse likely attacks.
In one of the scenarios, I was the head terrorist. It's not uncommon here in the regiment, they choose someone to be the head terrorist. And what happens is they set up an exercise that someone has taken hostages, and really the head terrorist is someone who's controlling the situation from inside. Change the scenario. They talk back to exercise control, who actually has written the whole scenario, a bit like a play, and it's all set up in a way so the operators who are out there can actually observe, pass back information and build up a profile of the terrorists and the organisation and chase intelligence down the line and things like that. Now, as the head terrorist, you would control things like moving hostages around the building to windows. You might take them up on the roof and hold them over the roof. If you're going to assassinate them and all certain things like that, then they would get into negotiations and they would say how the negotiations were going.
The squadron that carried the domestic CT role was involved in feverish build-up training to conduct tactical reconnaissances of all venues where Olympic events would take place.
Close up on the entrance, the overhead walkway above the competition, back to the northern end.
To inject new equipment, to develop things like a ship underway recovery capability.
Although the Olympic Games were on the Australian mainland, SAS Olympic Games training chose to defy Fortress Australia defence policy.
One of the handicaps of what was flawed strategic policy on the development of SAS capabilities was evident in the ban that was placed on doing any training for taking down a ship underway. In other words, capturing a ship that had been taken by terrorists. Now, this failing was well illustrated by the fact that those very skills were required, for instance, in the Tampa incident. But even more importantly, they were suddenly had to be rushed into service during the Olympic Games, when it was realised that if terrorists were to have a ship and take it down offshore in international waters and then head towards Sydney Harbour, then this ship would have to be captured well before it entered the harbour. And so the very complex skills of a combined helicopter and small craft assault onto that ship had to be practiced in very short time. Fortunately, SAS had always believed we'd need to do this. We had had people trained overseas in how to do it. Although we'd been specifically told not to do it, we'd always known it was going to be necessary.
Counter-terrorist capability was developed in the late 70s, and in regard to a hostage siege situation, especially within Australia, that capability hasn't been used, thankfully. But it remains a very important capability in a number of senses. The first one is virtually like an insurance policy, and the fact that you can demonstrate that you have this capability in itself becomes a deterrent. But it also became a very good development of individual and group skills that allowed the regiment to progress a whole range of operations that kept them very flexible. And you could say that over that long period of maintaining this very short notice, high tempo, very quick response, counter-terrorist capability, it provided the regiment the flexibility after September the 11th. Even prior to that, they would have been used in East Timor, but certainly after September the 11th, when the demands came onto the SAS regiment for operations in Afghanistan, then onto Iraq, it would have provided an extremely good foundation. It goes unseen by a lot of people, but it is there, and there is no doubt that these capabilities are monitored by those who may wish to do us harm. And it makes the target harder. And this hardening of the target, such as wanting to come and do harm to the Olympics, in itself is a deterrent, an important deterrent.
Although SAS were kept on standby throughout the Sydney Olympics, there were no terrorist attacks. But SAS accumulated expensive state-of-the-art counter-terrorist equipment they could not otherwise have afforded.
So, in terms of enhancing the man himself, there were huge enhancements with weapons, night vision equipment, radio equipment, sophisticated communications equipment. And we were starting to see opportunities open up for us, and we were able to do things that were just previously not possible.
SAS was on a steep learning curve in anticipating terrorist attacks.
I guess it was the Olympic Games that first exposed to us the need for an ability to respond to chemical, biological and radiological events should we be attacked in that way. And we had to cobble together a response for the Olympics. With the advent of 9/11, however, that all became more formalised, and the creation of Special Operations Command in 2002 saw the integration into the Special Forces community of the Incident Response Regiment, which is a Royal Australian Engineer unit, which is dedicated to responding to chemical, biological and radiological attacks.
So it was an early vote of confidence for us, and it was also the start of the melding of what we used to call the green and black capabilities into just a singular SAS capability. It was a quantum leap in the development of the regiment.
So we can see that the fact that the government had now had more faith in SAS, and we're starting to select them to go first and lead the way with operations. So the dog and pony show efforts of regiment had started to pay off.
While the Olympics required the SAS black roll, at the same time trouble suddenly flared up in the arc of instability that demanded its green roll skills.
In early 2000, as the intensity of build-up for the Olympics was taking place, the Solomons went down the gurgler. There'd been racial problems for a number of years. You had a group of island people who had come across to the mainland, taken political control, but who weren't the indigenous people of that particular part of the Solomons. Each of those ethnic groups developed a guerrilla army. And you had, I think it was the Guadalcanal Revolutionary Army and the Malay Eagle Force. They were the two big factions from memory. And police lost control, law and order went down the gurgler, the Prime Minister was locked in his hut. I can remember the Prime Minister saying, I asked for surgery and you give me Band-Aid.
Several Pacific Island nations requested Australian military intervention in the Solomons, but Australia feared being tagged neo-colonialist by Pacific and Asian leaders.
The Australian government was trying to solve this by political means because it couldn't afford to focus too much of its military force to the Solomons when it's preparing for the Olympics, the major event of the year. Concurrently, we still had troops deployed in Bougainville, and troops all over the place doing a whole range of things, and you could see its effort was just going to be sapped away by this poor old Pacific nation. We eventually stood up a force. Here we go again. We were a well-oiled greased machine at this stage. We just had troops everywhere. The CT squadron was scattered over the east coast. We had force elements all over Australia. In very short order, we had to collect all these bits and pieces and get them to Townsville, which we did because we were good at it. Again, elements of people went forward to the High Commission. Suffice to say that the Navy did the bulk of the evacuations. There were political agendas for this. The Navy was trying to prove its ships were capable. We had a naval CDF at the time. The Solomon Islands remained turmoil, but it was under control. We get back to the Olympics.
In 2003, as the conflict continued, Australia led New Zealand and 6 other Pacific nations in the Regional Assistance Mission to the Solomons. Some SAS soldiers were sent to the Australian High Commission in Honiara on Guadalcanal in case further evacuations of Australians were needed. In the Solomons, SAS also conducted Hearts and Minds patrols.
When we were going along the south of the island, we were going into villages that probably hadn't seen a white man since World War II. One town, one of the oldest men in the village, he sat me down and asked me if there was any way that I could get him a set of X-ray glasses. And he described this by saying, in World War II, he had the Americans over who were reading the comics, and they produced a set of glasses which allowed him to see through things. And he was adamant that they would work, and they did work, and he wanted me to go back to Australia and send him a set. The funny thing is just trying to maintain a straight face through that time, and give him a bit of pleasure, I suppose, a bit of comfort that he still respects and we still listen to him.
The training and niche missions merely rehearsed existing Special Forces paradigms and lacked the forward-thinking challenges of real operations. Many soldiers had missed out on the highly prized overseas missions, and the unit mindset was slowly stagnating. Yet SAS had to be divergent thinkers and unorthodox problem solvers to justify its existence.
To my mind, the tragedy of Special Operations Command of a missed opportunity is that, unfortunately, it has just reinforced the reactive nature of the National Australian Terrorist Plan, which is fundamentally in 3 parts. One part focused on intelligence gathering, a second part focused on asset or dignitary VIP type protection, and the third one based on the very reactive clean up the mess after it's happened type mode of operation. And a hell lot of resources have been poured into the third one, perhaps more to assuage the Australian population, a form of consolidation psyops, if you like. Whereas the reality is the greatest use of SAS, to my mind, is actually in intelligence gathering. The hard information that can only be won by somebody talking to somebody else at a particular place. Crucial human intelligence, and to my mind that's where SAS has got to be. It's got to develop the skill sets to win that intelligence. Using your strategic troops as fire brigades just doesn't make sense.
Prior to taking command of SAS, the Commander of Special Forces, Colonel Jim Wallace, had asked me to pay particular attention to the counter-terrorist capability, which in his view had become increasingly conventional.
Silverstone saw that a revolution of ideas was needed urgently if SAS was to emerge as the kind of postmodern force demanded for the asymmetric warfare of the 21st century. Sweeping changes would be needed if SAS was to win the coveted title, Australia's force of first choice.